Let's call this a work session to order. So work session is called certificate of participation. We'll find out what it really is when we start. Let's go around the table and do it for ourselves.
Christopher
Chris?
Constant.
Dick Training, something.
Felix Rivera.
Suzanne LeBrand.
Pete Peterson.
Amy Dabowski.
Mike Apple.
Okay. Mr. Falsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This work session is a bait and switch, or tease, depending on how you'd like to put it. It was noticed as on certificates of participation. It actually is the first of a two-step dance, where we're going to talk about an issue, and the certificates of participation will show up in a future work session as the potential solution to that issue. But the background is complicated enough that we thought it was worth having a table-setting conversation where we're explaining what we discovered and what the history is. So away we go. We're talking about the police and fire retirement system. This is the municipality's own police and fire retirement system that is not hers. And the history of that police, and the system is designed where there's one system composed of 3 plans. The plans are all old and now closed. So the first plan was started by an initiative petition all the way back in 1968 before we had unified. A second plan was set up at unification. And a third plan was established in 1984. In 1994, in the Tom Fink era years, there was a decision made to get out of the business of having our own police and fire retirement system and to put everybody on hers. So,
Could I clarify 1 second? It was not Tom Fink. It was Cheryl Clemenson, the same member from the Muldoon area that was responsible for this thing. Please go on.
that is a friendly amendment, Mr. Chair, because as you're about to see, well, first I'll mention that all of these plans are defined benefit plans. So, unlike the defined contribution plans that the lower and the newer tiers of PERS have turned into, these all promise the beneficiary specific dollar amounts and specific benefits.
And they are only pension, not medical.
True.
So only what?
Their pensions, no medical with this. But this is how we were able to attract police and fire to come to work for us because we had a great retirement system. They knew they could count on when they retired. Anyway, sorry.
So the story began in 1968, but for our purposes, it really gets going in 1994, when during the Tom Fink era, perhaps not Tom Fink himself, he noted that the system itself, across all 3 different plans, was fully funded. And he said, maybe the assembly said, somebody said in that era, why is the municipality going to continue to contribute to these plans when the system has all the money it needs? Plan 1, and I don't know why this happened, it might have just been the go tech boom. Google is coming into the universe, Apple is supposedly making lots of money, is 135% funded, the second plan is 112, and plan 3 is pretty close at almost 90%. So, the Assembly, and here's where Mr. Trainey's deep experience proves true, Assembly Member Clemenson introduces this resolution, AO 9495, that says a couple of things. One is that we're going to shut it down and put everybody on PERS. But the other thing it says is, in no event is the municipality going to contribute any more to this system if we have enough money in the system as a whole. As you might expect, this did not sit well with some folks, and the explosion of litigation begins. It actually really continues.
Little sidebar for a second. The shortest street in the world is named after Cheryl. It's there off of Bergar Road, right next to Costco. There's a little tiny street that's about a half a block long. Tim Potter did that because she was such a pain. It's the world's shortest street. There's nobody goes there. It goes nowhere. But it's named that. He did that on purpose. Sorry.
So there was a lawsuit called Galleon 1 with the members of Plan 1 and Plan 2 for the 1968 to 1975 and 1975 to 1984 folks said, wait a minute, you can't take our overfunding and throw that at Plan 3. That was money that we, the employees and the municipality, put into those plans. The surplus should be ours. It turned out that was actually just piling on a bunch of other complicated litigation that was already underway. As the plans came online, each of them had similar and confusingly similar, but slightly different beneficiary rules. And there was a big fight about how accrued leave was supposed to affect what your salary was for purposes of turning out for litigation, turning out your ultimate benefits. That was called the Woosley litigation. I'm just name checking that. By 1997, Plan 3 members got into the game too, and they said, Well, we're also going to sue because Plan 3 is underfunded, and we want to continue to force municipalities to continue making contributions to Plan 3, possibly because they saw that Plan 1 and Plan 2 were setting themselves up for some kind of debate about what happens to the surplus assets in the system. And that takes us a few years down the road where, because the stock market is continuing to boom, even though the municipality turned off all of its contributions in 1994, everything got to 100% funding. And so then Plan 3 had to pivot, and they filed a different lawsuit, and they said, everybody sued and said, okay, there's too much money in this system. It has been put there as a result of employee contributions and employer contributions. I think the municipality's position at the time, and I won't swear to this, was that we get to take all of the surplus. The employees said, no way, we helped build that war chest. We get at least some of it. Maybe they said all of it. But suffice to say, we now are in this very expensive, very convoluted litigation. Everybody's suing everybody. Winding the clock forward to 2000, the stock market still going gangbusters, and now there is a lot of money in the system, and nothing has really changed because the lawsuits are still dragging on. Plan 1 is now almost 200% funded. Plan 2, 174. Plan 3, 135. And the situation is sort of increasingly untenable, so there was a great big powwow. They say we can't just have all this money trapped in here at 159% across the whole system. We got to figure out what this money is supposed to do. At the time, in the very end of 2000, or the very beginning of 2000, the system was composed of, had 785 members who were drawing benefits, and a lot of people who were still on the payroll. So there were still 346 people who had been hired before 1984. And it was these folks we had to sort of come to some understanding with. And there was an understanding. I listened to the work session from the year 2000, which is, first of all, a great excuse to listen to the dulcet tones of Rick Meister again, but also just sort of interesting history. It sounds like they sort of literally sent these people away to Girdwood, and they said, don't come back until you fix this. And there was a big powwow, there was a grand resolution, and here's what they came up with. They said, we're going to resolve all litigation. We are wiping the slate completely clean. And the way we're getting there is we're going to say the surplus monies are going to come out of the system and they're going to get split. The individual plan members took out about $58 million. And individually, they got chunky checks. The settlement agreement actually had these numbers. Those turned out to be a little low when they did the final actuarial calculations. Plan 1 members got $125,000. Plan 2 members got $100,000. Plan 3 members got...
Bill, let me interrupt you for a second. We've been joined by Mr. Weddleton. Welcome, sir.
So $58 million gets cashed out to the beneficiaries. The municipality takes out a one-time $40 million payment and makes clear in the settlement agreement that this is still a system that we are ultimately responsible for, we the municipality. So if ever there is some kind of shortfall, we have promised these as retirement benefits, and that is a constitutional obligation. We're on the hook for that. So what did that do? That cash out of the system of, when you added it all up, 56, 58 for the beneficiaries, 40 for the municipality, lawyers got $3 million when this was all done. About $100 million comes out of the system. They didn't take it all the way down to 100. They thought, we're going to be really responsible, we'll drop it, and they said they were keeping this 16% contingency reserve. They left it in this position. And I'll say the work session is really interesting, because at the time, they spent 90% of that work session saying, what happens when it gets way overfunded again? Can't we come to some new understanding of how the money is going to get cashed out? And sort of wringing their hands and said, it took a long time to get here, we didn't really solve that problem. And Assembly Member Von Gamigan is the only one who says, what happens if the system gets underfunded?
Von Gamigan.
Von Gamigan.
Sorry.
Gamigan. And the response that she receives on the tape is sort of amazing, knowing what's about to happen. The actuary or whoever was speaking says, the system would have to lose value for 2 straight years. That is not going to happen. I mean, it could happen, but it's not going to happen.
Not likely.
You got to listen to this tape. It's just stupid.
But
Hey, they were good assembly members, okay? I may even be in this, so I'm telling you.
Actuaries can never get us in trouble.
Yeah, well,
What actually
look at PERS.
is that the
For the
bubble
record.
starts to cool. the system does move into an underfunding position, but there's still a lot of people in the system, and it's not terrible. So the municipality and the remaining active members in the system bring it back up to full funding. This is the sort of first stock market bubble that's weathered here in the 2000-2003 period. But like I said, I just jumped ahead a little. There's still 240, almost 340 active members in the system. So they all make more contributions, we make more contributions, they bring the system back into a full funding, and then the stock market recovers and we're back to an overfunding situation. Everything seems to be gravy, but then you guys remember what happens in 2009. We have the Great Recession. That system loses a tremendous amount of its value.
We've been joined by Mr. Steele.
About a fifth of its value. And that brings us all the way to today. So the system today is about 80% funded. But what is different about today that was not the case back in 2003 or earlier in 2000 is that there's almost nobody left to pay for that shortfall other than us.
Except the city. We're required to pay for
There are
it.
now 740 people who are receiving benefits out of the system. There are 17 still on the payroll. So some folks were still hired on before 1994. We're still making contributions. But for the most part, it is now on us to fix this. So to sort of wind it all together, once upon a time, the municipality came to a grand resolution, took out $40 million. Now we're on the hook for the shortfall. And today's shortfall, $75.76 million. So there's not a lot of other people to help us pay for that. What that means in the near term, and why I've been telling this story, is that for the last several years, we have been required by the way the system is set up and the conversation with the actuaries to make annual contributions in the amount of more than $10 million. The system is overseen by a board, which has members nominated by the members and members nominated by the municipality. They adopt the actuarial calculations and rules that govern how the system is to work. In 2013, they decided that the debts of the system should be retired on a 15-year timeline. And the way that calculation works, when we turn the crank today, we're going to be paying $10 million a year. In our budget environment, this $10 million sort of stuck out as there's something to be done about that. We probably could put that money to different better uses. And this is where I'm now just teasing the solution that we are teeing up for the future work session. Part of the solution comes out of looking at what the system is supposed to do under the status quo. If the actuarial assumptions and direction from the board remain the same, it's projected actuarial, figuring out how long people are going to live, when they're going to retire, what the market returns are going to be, how we're going to be invested. The municipality is expected to make $10 million payments over the next 10 years with a little bit of noise in 2030 and 2031. But it was striking to us that the system itself is supposed to live for a lot longer than that. So we are expected to pay beneficiaries of Plan 1 through 2036, Plan 2 through 2042, Plan 3 through 2044. So our status quo setup is that we are rushing to full funding by 2028 or thereabouts, so that the system can remain in stasis for a lot longer. We think there is a different way to crack that nut, and that is what we're hoping to bring to you at the real certificates of participation work session on October 20th, when we have our bond counsel, Cynthia Weed, Steve Cantor, financial advisor, and some other folks.
Bill, will we have the members of the board here attending that?
I don't know.
There will
be
be
one
invited.
because Mike Abbott is a member.
I just want to make sure, Mike, we invite him, because
You bet.
before,
And
they've been told they've been left out.
Dan Moore is with us here in the audience. Dan and I are both members
I
of
know.
the board. The way the board is structured, the administration selects 3 members, and it is Dan Moore, David Gottstein, and I that are currently representing the municipality. Police beneficiaries select 3 members. Dave Cook, current captain at APD, Ev Robbins, many of you guys will remember Ev Robbins, and Bill Herrick, I think Bill Herrick is a 3rd. The fire members, there are 3 fire members as well. Jim Bowman, who's currently the chair of the board, Paul Burns, and Andy Provincia. So those are the 9 members of the board. Prior to the settlement in 2000 that Bill just described, the board was divided 4 and 4. 4 beneficiary representatives and 4 muni representatives. No tie-breaking procedure. And as you can imagine, especially when they got into this overfunding deal and a fairly equally balanced argument about who owned that overfunding, they could not get anything done. They couldn't figure out how to invest their money. They couldn't figure out how to hire staff. Everything was polluted by this decision of what to do with this surplus of cash. So as part of the settlement, the muni decided that it gave up its co-equal management of the board and agreed to, instead of being 4 of 8, to be 3 of 9. Now, the muni is slightly protected in that some decisions of the board, some relatively important decisions, require a supermajority of board members. So changing the actuarial assumptions, changing the asset allocation are 2 important examples, require 7 out of 9 members. So the municipal representatives are required, some of them at least, are required to support any change in those assumptions, which gives the municipality some level of protection against the beneficiaries running wild. To the board's credit, they have the beneficiary members have never tried to move in that direction. They have never done so. But as Bill illustrated, we have paid about $50 million in extra contributions since 2008, 2009. We're on track to pay another depending on what you think the stock market's going to do over the next 20 years, somewhere between 100 and 200 million more to keep the system in the right shape. So what we're recommending is a different approach, and that is basically to finance our commitment now and pre-fund the system with approximately 65 to 70 million dollars up front, and then eliminate the need for those $10 million payments that Bill showed you going forward. We would still have to pay the debt service on that 65 to 70 million, but that would be less expensive than the 10 million we're currently slated to pay. So this is the choice that we're proposing that the Assembly consider. The item is being introduced on Tuesday night. We've recommended it be set for public hearing on the 24th, and we've asked for another work session before the 24th where Robert and Dan and Ross Griswold can present the financing device that we recommend the Assembly consider in order to generate that 65 to 70 million dollars to reduce our long-term sort of annual payments into the system. We've had preliminary conversations with the board. They are very pleased that the municipality is contemplating this. They're not crazy about being at an 80% funded rate, although it's not really the end of the world, but they'd rather be higher. And so the notion of pre-funding that our outstanding liability is attractive to the board, and they're willing to consider, at least at this point, some changes in the actuarial assumptions and the asset allocation that would reduce the risk going forward of our investment strategy. Because once you get close to 100%, you don't need to be as aggressive with your investments as you do if you're trying to get from 80 to 100. So the board is open to considering those changes, and has set board meetings, 2 meetings in November at this point, to act or at least consider action if the municipality moves forward with this approach. So it does have a big near-term budget impact. You saw in our presentation last Friday that if we move forward as the administration recommends, The $10 million contribution that would otherwise be required in 2018 is not required at all. The way we would set up the financing for our single large contribution, the first debt service payments on that would not come due until 2019. So 2018 would be sort of this transitional year, and there would not be a contribution to police and fire retirement. We'd basically be giving them $65 or $70 million, and therefore they would not need $10 million from us in 2018. And then in 2019, we would start paying the debt service on that $65 or $70 million. And it's the terms of that financing that our finance team will describe to you in a week or two at your convenience.
Mr. Abbott, Mr. Steele?
Yeah, Mike, that leads me to wonder about some of the other large chunks of change that we need for investment going forward, specifically in the short term or shorter term, like the port stuff. All that's been taken into consideration?
It has. If we move forward with additional self-financing at the port, as we are at least contemplating, that would be funded entirely by port revenue bonds and would not draw
Different
on
source.
any of the same revenue systems that this debt would draw on.
Is that all, sir?
There's other things other than that, but that was certainly when I was.
We're not suggesting this is a small decision on the part of the Assembly. This is a significant commitment, but in light of the short and long-term challenges that the status quo presents, we believe we're virtually required to show you a different option for how to move forward. And then we'll work with you to discuss the pros and cons of that and hope for your support on the 24th.
Chris?
Yeah, it just sounds to me, and I'm sure we'll get into the details of this like it's backwards, that if we're going to make a massive investment and then hope that the board makes a decision to be more conservative, what happens if and when they don't?
There are, it might be appropriate for the Assembly to talk to the board and in a future work session, and or potentially condition some or all of this investment on changes acceptable to the administration and the Assembly.
John?
Sorry I was late, maybe you already covered this, but can't we just talk to the board and get them to lower the payments so we just fully fund it in 2024?
We could. That is within the board's purview, but I think based on, and Dan can speak for himself on this, the board is not currently comfortable stretching the actuarial assumptions out 30 or 30 plus years, which is what it would take in order to substantially lower those annual appropriations. As you saw from Bill's presentation, the different plans have different anticipated lives. Plan 1 will finish much sooner than Plan 3. So they have different plan lengths. I think the board is interested and willing to consider different actuarial timelines for each of the 3 plans, which it has not done now. It has a blended 15-year amortization period right now. But it is willing to consider, as Bill and Dan and others have suggested, tailored amortization schedules, different ones for 1, 2, and 3, which I think makes sense. But we don't believe that the board would, and we understand their constraints from their members' perspective. They're concerned about not having the fund not being fully funded and not making significant progress towards full funding in the event, highly unlikely event that somehow the muni is unable to make its commitments. And if the fund is underfunded over the long term, then at the back end, then the muni is basically just writing the actual benefit checks. And they're concerned, based, with a fiduciary responsibility to their plan members, that is not prudent. So they want to see the fund get to 100% in a reasonable period of time. And whereas we might say reasonable for Plan 3 is 35 years, they're probably not going to agree with that. And I think, you know, there's some basis for their concern on that.
I will tell you, having met with the board over the years, the argument is we gave you $40 million. What more do you want? You know, from their perspective. Bill?
I'm just going to add that I don't have the same level of insight into the board's functions that those who are actually on the board have, but I have seen email traffic which would suggest to me that the board might be more willing to re-amortize the debts if we made this upfront infusion. So the proposal, and it's not a secret proposal, it's in the assembly agenda. You can read the AO and the AM, which sets it all out. We're sort of on a two-step timeline, partly because we got folks who are out of town now because we're waiting for some additional numbers from the actuarial. But the proposal's not secret. Our understanding is that the board is more willing to sort of help us along with those games. If we make a kind of upfront good faith payment where we're pushing the system a lot closer to the full fund.
Right.
But if we're 90%,
John?
how much could they push that they would help us out?
We'll be close to done, depending on market behavior and, you know, investment returns. And the actuarial assumptions on, you know, are just that. You know, folks live longer than anticipated, or retire sooner and or later, the remaining retirees. You're making assumptions about their spouses, because in some cases the benefits are inheritable by a spouse, qualifying spouse. So there's a lot of assumptions in there about how that would work. So anyway, we're eager for your thoughts. There's a lot of additional material if there are members that are interested in actually reading the actuarial valuations of the system, which have a lot of detail on how that is calculated and the justifications for the different assumptions. Those are essentially public documents, and Dan and I can make sure that you have copies of those if you're interested. They're not exactly page turners, I'll say, but if you're diligent, you can find a kernel or a nugget or two in there.
Mr. Constance?
Yes, I'd be interested in analysis of if this were done in a multi-stage process. You know, where we do part of it, not over 20 or 30 years, but over several years, to see performance and to see these changes happen in real time, as opposed to making a full commitment all at once. It's probably cheaper to do it that way.
Safer.
But yeah, I would love to see the analysis of how that would look.
Okay.
Mr. Peterson, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the $40 million that we got, was that put in fund balance? Has that been invested over a long period of time, or did we blow that on something, or where is that?
Any benefits?
Through the chair, I think half of it did get saved. I think the other half, I think the technical term is it did get blown, but I haven't completely figured that out. There is a resolution with interesting history where the assembly resolves to take the 40 million and put 20 in the MOA trust fund. Good, so that's permanent fund money. So that money is still living there, still spinning off 4.25% dividends. And they put the other half into something called Fund 731, the Trust Fund Reserve. That fund doesn't, well, if it exists today, it has a zero balance. I think that was a fancy name for a fund that you could spend any way you wanted. And the history is even a little more interesting. There is a veto message from Mayor Mystrom that said, outrageous, this should go to immediate tax relief. And then there is a veto withdrawal message, which sort of says, never mind. And I don't know the full history. But that's
Mr.
much
Traney,
better.
would you care to comment?
I want to see the documents from that time period.
You want to see which way you voted?
Yes, I do. I've set the ball since then. But I'm sure if Mayor Meisterman had access to a slush fund, they spent it. Just my impression.
As with every mayor.
Madam Clerk, would you make sure the board is invited to attend the semi-meeting on the 20th when this is presented to us, phase 2? I want to make sure the board has no illusions as to whether they're invited or not. I want them here. Because I met with the board. Elby and I did a couple of times. I think you were there. We met with the board a couple of times. I want to make sure they understand where we're going with this. No matter how we go, they need to know we're not playing games with them, because these people are very worried about their retirement. For many of them, it's the only retirement they have is this system.
Right, and it's important, you've heard more recently from another group of beneficiaries for which there's a lot of overlap, which is the police and fire medical group. That there is a lot of overlap, it's almost 100% overlap between the retirement system and the medical system. And they've had different kinds of issues with us. This was a group that when their pensions were set up a long time ago, before '94, we provided a medical retirement benefit and a pension retirement benefit separately. And we still do. So that's managed differently. So you've met with a lot of the same beneficiaries, although the leaders are not the same ones. So the board members on the Police and Fire Medical Trust, is there any overlap this year? Yeah. There has been from time to time some overlap, but there isn't now. And that's different from the leadership of the Police and Fire Retirement System. So you will often hear from one group or the other, and they may or may not be talking about both issues.
For the record, Mr. Dunbar's joined us.
And Chair, I'll just
Mr.
add
Falsey?
Sort of final note, that we do want to make sure that everyone does leave with the bottom line, that the municipality must pay this. This is not even.
It's not an option.
A moral obligation, this is Alaska State constitutional obligation. If we go bankrupt as a municipality, this is probably one of the first steps that has to get paid off the top. So the conversation is really a question about how we pay and when we pay. And we think we've happened on a solution that gives us a liquidity benefit while also really incorporating this gesture of good faith to the board itself that says part of this solution puts more money on your side of the ledger. You'll hear more about that from the real experts.
Now, Mr. Abbott, you're going to be leaving us on the 1st November. Is your participation on this dependent upon your position as city manager, or I'm just wondering who's going to be and you have no idea, you can't tell us now, but I hate the fact we're going to lose all your expertise as the representative on this board for the municipality.
So technically, the municipal representatives on the board don't have to be municipal employees. And in fact,
Okay.
David Gottstein is currently one of our board members and is not a municipal employee. So I would be eligible to serve after that. It'll be up to the mayor to decide whether that's what he wants or not. I'll work with Ethan to figure out how this works, and I'm not moving out of town.
Just from my perspective, would you let Ethan know that as
And
one
I've got
person's
good
been on here
relationships,
since then?
As does Dan. Dan's been on the board.
I know he has. I know Dan's been there, but I want your
years.
expertise helping us through this.
I will be available if the mayor needs me.
Thank you.
One more question, Rick.
Yes, Chris?
So the thing that comes to mind now that I hear about it, shifting the capital into our own pool so we have liquidity, that gives me fear that that becomes a pool of money that gets spent and lost again, and we find ourselves not just X amount, $10 million a year in the hole, but then suddenly $10 million plus this. Can you guys give us when you come back, kind of an analysis of how we're not going to fall into that trap?
Yeah, and I think there's some good answers to that. One of the answers is the system has hundreds of millions of dollars in it now to get it at 80% funded. If the board, with municipal votes, decided it's all going to do junk bonds and penny stocks, it could squander all of that money.
Right.
So it's only an incremental additional risk to put more money into the system. But I think there are other things which are even more comfort-inducing that you'll hear from folks in 2 weeks or maybe even now about how putting more money in the system actually lets you put some of the money in a safer class because it can be money that's spinning off immediate benefit.
And he hinted at that, but
That's correct. And both in terms of asset allocation, target earnings, the earnings target, and the way that our sort of surge of or supplemental contribution, how that would be managed by the system. So, I mean, the system spends about $30 million a year on benefits. It's really sort of at its peak in terms of paying out. It's got a lot of retired beneficiaries that haven't yet, they're still pulling a benefit check. So if we put in $60 or $70 million, maybe that money isn't even invested in the near term. That's just the cash they use to pay benefits, and they keep the rest of their fund fully invested as it is now. That's only one option.
Right.
And then Dan has also asked them to explore the possibility of using our money and then considering $10 million a year as our regular contribution, even though the system is managing it as a $65 or $70 million chunk. And it's earning 6-7% during that time frame. So there's a variety of methods. Dan and Robert and Ross and Steve Cantor, our financial analyst, will be able to describe those to you in a couple of weeks, and that'll be a part of our presentation.
Just a quick follow-up then.
Go ahead, sir.
And I'm from a traditional fundraising background, university, foundations and such. And donors can often put restrictions on the use of funds. Is this something that the Assembly could, through some vehicle, restrict those funds to be in a certain set of allocations, less volatile, more conservative? Is that something we would have the means to do through our appropriation process? And you can answer that in 2 weeks. I don't need an off-the-cuff answer.
That's a good response.
Yeah.
Maybe, I think is off the top of my head, and it would mean though that it wouldn't necessarily credit to the system as cleanly as the approach we've at least contemplated. It might not count towards moving us from 80 to 90+%. But it's, and I encourage you all, either independently or as a group, to meet with the trustees. I think you'll find them to be a very reasonable group of folks that care both about their beneficiaries as well as about the municipality generally.
Any other questions from Assembly members? Thank you. This work session's over with. The next one begins at 1 o'clock.
1:15.
1:15? Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Take care, bang the gavel.